I call for the last speech in Proposition Lara Brown. Lara is a first-year student reading theology at Downing College. She won this slot through open audition. Lara, the ear of the House is yours.
I've spent an awful lot of time telling people that I am in fact a Republican. However, in reality, I do have to accept that this is not entirely true. While I do think that my ideal state would not include an unelected figurehead, I accept the monarchy offers valuable advantages to Britain. The presence of a non-political figurehead is hugely beneficial to a country. Imagine, for a second, that we lived under a presidential figure who espoused staunch political views on Brexit or austerity. And if you don't feel like the effort of conjuring up such an image, simply look to America and imagine that we had some sort of Trumpian figure as an alternative to the monarchy. This being said, I'd like to argue that the House of Windsor have a purpose in our state. They provide political neutrality necessary to order in government while offering a more unofficial moral steer. However, having defined this function, I think that it's self-evident they're failing to fulfill their arguably vital roles in government. Considering first how well the monarchy live up to Roger Scruton's argument, already cited by Proposition, they offer a light above politics, it's completely obvious that the House of Windsor are failing. While Prince Charles's Black Spider memos were ultimately met by little criticism from the press, they crucially demonstrate the monarchy's readiness to intervene. Prince Charles chose to exert his influence on currying favour with the Qatari royal family and blocking the works of an architect who he didn't like. This is an admittedly minor piece of unconstitutional lobbying, but the precedent set remains, demonstrating that the royal family are aware of their ability to influence politics and will do so readily. Now, throughout this debate, on both sides, we seem to accept that the Queen is a sort of untouchable figure. Proposition so far seem to have argued that the House of Windsor are flawed, but the Queen is separate from this. I'd like to extend the burden set by this and answer this floor speech. I think the Queen is tied to the House of Windsor, and I do not think that the Queen is beyond reproach. A perhaps more extreme example of the use of the monarchy attempting to use undue influence might be found from the Queen's involvement in the 1975 dismissal of Whitlam, the elected Labour Prime Minister, in favour of Malcolm Fraser. The refusal by the Australian government to release the letter she sent in response to FOI, I think is completely telling. I think that itself will indicate to all of us that she clearly had a very significant hand in this. But if that's too abstract for you, if some letters locked down in some archives isn't enough, merely look to the involvement of the Governor-General Sir John Kerr, the Queen's representative, whose office can only be described as an extension of the Queen and therefore the House of Windsor's own power. And his chosen actions in 1975 must be acknowledged as royal political intervention. Anyone doubting the extent to which Sir John Kerr's actions were endorsed by the Queen might wish to consider the reply from the palace itself in response to calls for them to undo his actions. Here we go. As we understand the situation here, the Australian Constitution firmly places the prerogative powers of the Crown in the hands of the Governor-General as the representative of the Queen of Australia. The actions of the representative of the Queen of Australia prompted widespread protests, and the dismissal has widely been accepted to be the greatest constitutional crisis in Australia's history. To those that defend the House of Windsor and they claim they have little to no power, they're a valuable figurehead and we need them for unity, I'd ask you to explain to me why it is that the Queen has dismissed a Prime Minister in living memory. It is undeniable that the Queen has failed to act with the impartiality which defines much of her role. The moment in which the Queen has the greatest constitutional power occurs in a hung parliament, and therefore her behaviour in such instances is the most valuable in assessing how she lives up to her claims of political neutrality. In 1974, Labour were able to win 301 seats, beating the Conservatives 2797, but not achieving a majority. The Queen here was faced with a huge political decision, and she personally had the power to decide who she wished to invite to form a government. She decided to appeal to the incumbent Prime Minister and allowed Heath to attempt to form a government. It was only after his failures in talks with Jeremy Thorpe that Harold Wilson was finally allowed to step up, forming a minority government several days after the election on the 3rd of March. The principle here seems sound, right? The Queen has chosen that the incumbent Prime Minister is the first to be invited to form a government in the instance of a hung Parliament. By setting a precedent like this, the Queen was able to remain neutral, she was able not to make her own judgment on the event, and she was able to prevent herself from intervening and having huge political stir over the country. I think we can all agree that's a relatively fair precedent. How then might one explain her actions in the 2010 election after the incumbent Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, won 258 seats while Cameron had 306? Despite ignoring seat share last time and appealing to the incumbent Prime Minister, the Queen chose instead to allow David Cameron to form a government. Her actions with respect to these events show absolutely no political precedent. She isn't following any sort of rules, she's merely acting in favour of her own evident right-wing bias. In recent years, the potential for the occurrence of a hung Parliament has arguably been hugely increased. While in 1974 no one predicted such an event, the papers now forecast close call elections regularly. Here, the well-trodden claim that the Queen acts with increasingly reduced power proves false. If the trend of closely called elections to continue, so too will the trend of the Queen having a huge amount of political power in deciding who gets the first chance to form a government. The Queen's astronomical power to therefore support the Conservative Party over other parties is therefore going to continue and increase. Labour have suffered as a result of the Queen's own political biases on 3 separate occasions. In 1974, when Wilson was not allowed to initially form a government and had to wait for Heath to be given his chance. In 1975, when Gough Whitlam was dismissed, and in 2010, when Gordon Brown was not permitted the chance to form a government himself. I think that it's been fairly proven that the House of Windsor have failed to act neutral and is a constitutionally valuable arbiter of politics. The Crown also defined for themselves a second purpose of the monarchy. They refer to the head of state as someone, as the Queen, who's supported by her family in order to provide both a moral steer and a sense of unity for the country. The Queen clearly attempts to fulfill this role when she gave us the advice that, even with the most deeply held differences, treating the other person with respect and as a fellow human being is always a good first step towards greater understanding. Now, how can this hold true when her own son, Prince Andrew, failed to treat the victims of Epstein with respect, instead choosing to holiday with a confirmed paedophile? Now, there's staying consistent and on message, as side opposition argued is very difficult. And then there's inviting a man given an arrest warrant for the sexual assault of a minor to your daughter's birthday party. This is, of course, one of the most morally depraved events which any member of the House of Windsor has been involved in recent years. And I would argue that it itself should entirely prevent the House from offering any sense of unity to the country. This debate isn't about Harry and Meghan. In drawing back from the royal family, they have done nothing which might bring about its failure. Instead, the problem rests with the sheer expanse of the monarchy. The extended relatives of the Queen should not be thought of as members of the House of Windsor. All they serve to do is use large amounts of public money to help heap scandals upon themselves and the House of Windsor. Now, I was asked in a floor speech what a valuable alternative to the current state of the House of Windsor is. And I would argue that it's Prince Charles' desire for a slimmed-down monarchy, which I believe is the only way of setting the House of Windsor back on course. But, until this is done, and until the head of state becomes a truly neutral arbiter of politics, the House of Windsor is necessarily failing. And this is why I urge you to propose the motion.
Thank you very much, Lara.